I was standing at my kitchen counter stirring oat milk into my coffee when the wall phone rang, sharp and steady. The kind of ring that cuts a quiet afternoon in two, sunlight sliding across the framed family photo and flashing off the glass like a signal I could not yet read. And when I pressed speaker and said hello, Angela did not say hello back, she said it like a headline. "We are moving tomorrow, Mama, I sold your house." And the sentence sat on the counter between my coffee and my breath, hot at the edges and cold in the middle, while I answered with a voice I barely recognized, "I see, nothing more," not because I agreed, but because some words deserve walls to hit before you speak again. I stood very still as the phone hummed its small satisfied hum, and I watched a fleck of light travel over my husband's smile in the photo, the same smile he wore on Sundays when he told the usher we were blessed, long before he left this earth and left me with a porch that remembers his steps, and a ring that remembers his heat. I set the cup down and opened the drawer with the checkbook and the coupons and the birthday cards I never mailed. I took out the ledger with its thin pages that drink ink, and the smell rose up like it always does when truth meets paper, and I started listing what loving a grown child had cost in dollars while it cost me far more in quiet. 3 years of $500 each month for rent, that is $18,000, grocery deliveries when the pantry at their place echoed, furniture when the sofa springs sighed, a winter of gas money when his car would not turn over, little transfers labeled just because and you got this. I wrote the numbers like beads on a string and watched them gather. I tapped the old calculator and it clicked out the sum as if it were a kind of prayer. And when the screen blinked back at me I did not sigh, I nodded, the way a woman nods when the story lines up with what her bones already know. The phone lit again and this time it was not Angela, it was the world, a bubble on my screen showing her new chapter selfie, Evan at her shoulder with his chin lifted, his watch tilted toward the lens so the face caught the light, and then the second photo, a sold sign planted crooked in my yard, red and white and proud, champagne glasses crowded near the frame like punctuation, and a comment river full of little gold celebrations from people who do not know that joy wears masks. I let my finger hover. I did not type a single word. I set the phone face down and watched the light on the wood go from warm to flat because storm clouds had pulled up their chairs. In the hallway the pale pink dress I bought for the next family milestone hung beneath its plastic like a small cloud that had lost its sky, and beside it on the tray sat my wedding ring, a thin circle that once meant forever and now means memory and promise kept to self. I rolled it between my fingers until the metal learned my temperature again. Objects tell the truth when people do not. Dresses kept on hangers do not lie about what did not happen. That soft fabric whispered a lesson I wish I had learned sooner. Not every plan deserves your breath. The house breathed with me, quiet but not empty. The clock ticked a stubborn rhythm. A bus exhaled at the corner. Somewhere a neighbor laughed at something that had nothing to do with me, and I pressed my palms to the counter to feel the steady cool of a surface that does its job whether you weep or grin. Then I said it out loud so the room could hear me learning. I only help special people. The sentence tasted new. It stood up straight. It did not bow. I said it again, softer. I only help special people. And in the saying I understood that the most dangerous habit I ever picked up was treating myself as an afterthought. Has anyone listening ever been erased from your own family joy by a single phone call? Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me your city so I can picture your porch light. Or your kitchen lamp while I pour this out. Because I know I am not the only one standing with a cooling cup and a hot truth. I pulled the bank statements from their thin sleeves and lined them up in a row. I set the checkbook beside them, and I reached into the box where my husband's papers sleep, the old manila envelope with my name in his careful hand. I had avoided it since the funeral because the weight of it felt like another goodbye. I placed it on the table but did not break the seal. Not tonight. Soon there is a time to open a door and a time to lean your shoulder against it and listen. I made a list on my legal pad with lines long enough to pull me forward. Call First National, end the automatic transfers, add text alerts, ask for no third-party flags, change every password, write down every date and time, photograph the old deadbolt, note who holds which keys, find the missing spare and make sure it is missing on purpose. Ask Mr. Klein at the bank to print forms and place them face up so I do not have to flip anything to know what I am signing. Call a locksmith for the morning. Ask about grade 1 deadbolts. Call Daniel Weber, the elder law attorney whose card sits under the magnet with my church bake sale photo. Ask what he calls this thing where love is used like a crowbar. Ask what words a woman can use that do not set fire to her own porch. The sun slid lower and the kitchen light thinned from honey to tin. I walked the rooms I had painted and paid for and prayed over. I touched the nick by the back door where Max once scraped a bike handle. I straightened a picture of my parents in their best clothes on a porch long gone to dust. I ran the vacuum in lines I did not need because the sound said some things can be handled with effort and time. Warm dust rose. The smell was a memory of Saturdays and gospel on the radio. I plated a small supper and ate it because a body needs steady fuel when storms blow in. I washed the plate and set it in the rack. I dried my hands and kept my eyes off the phone while it lit and went dark again and again like a tiny lighthouse for a ship I am no longer waiting to see. I took the dress down and laid it across the bed and smoothed it once before I tucked it back and set it to hang again. Not every grief needs an audience, some simply ask you to nod. In the hall the air held the faint scent of lemon oil from last weekend when I polished the banister smooth. I ran my hand along the curve and thought, this house knows me, this house remembers the way I walked when I was 20 and when I was 60 and today. It held my secrets and songs and now it held my resolve like a candle cupped against the wind. I picked up the envelope again, weighed it, heavier than paper should be, and slipped it into my purse because tomorrow I would need it near me. Back at the table I opened the black-covered notebook and dated the page. I wrote her words exactly. We are moving tomorrow. I sold your house. I wrote the time and the length of the call. I wrote my words too, I see, and nothing else. I drew a small box beside the sentence, I only help special people, and I put a check there like a promise kept to future me. Then I walked to the front window and pulled the curtain back an inch to look at the yard the way you look at a story you think you already know, the grass a little high, the edges in need of a cut, the birdbath begging for a scrub. I imagined their sign pitched there for photographs and I let the curtain fall, the ring went back on its tray, the ledger in the drawer, the envelope stayed in my purse. I turned off the kitchen light and the dark settled kind rather than cruel. I lay down and sleep stayed at the door like a shy animal. I counted my breath, I told my body it was safe, I told my spirit it was seen. I told the little girl inside me we are done begging to be treated like we matter. Somewhere between the 7th and the 12th slow breath a calm arrived that was not borrowed, it was made of quiet and decision and a list with lines long enough to carry me. Morning would come with burnt coffee at a bank counter and the crisp slide of forms. Morning would come with a man named Weber who would use words like preserve and capacity and record and would teach me how to set a boundary without setting anything on fire. Morning would come with a locksmith truck and a new envelope of keys and a click that sounds like a lullaby. Morning would come with a neighbor who sees and a church sister whose prayer wraps a hand around mine. Morning would come with the first call I do not answer and the second call I also do not answer. Morning would come with the page where I write the first line of a new chapter and mean it. Before I closed my eyes I lifted the phone and tapped record. My own voice in the dark sounded older and steadier than I expected. Note to self, call First National first thing. Ask Mr. Klein to cancel the automatic payments and add text alerts and place a hold on any ings I did not request. Then call Daniel Weber, ask for language I can read plain. Ask how to keep a paper trail that stands up when the wind howls. Ask what to do if someone arrives with a smile and a lawyer and calls my no confusion. And then I added one more line, say it again out loud until it is part of your breath. I only help special people. I pressed save and set the phone down and folded my hands over my chest the way my grandmother used to when she had decided a thing. And in the quiet I could almost hear my husband's voice saying, take your time, Loretta. Not in fear, in order. The truth does not hurry, but it does not hide either. I fell asleep with the ring shining very faintly in the corner of my eye and the envelope warm against the leather of my purse. Not opened yet, not needed yet, soon. Morning arrived with the pale gray light that turns my kitchen window into frosted glass, and I moved with purpose rather than hurry. A list in my pocket and the old manila envelope in my purse like a steadying stone. I called First National before my slippers were cold and asked for Mr. Klein. When his voice came on the line he sounded the way paper feels when it is new, firm and clean. Mrs. Walker, what can I do for you today? You can cancel the automatic transfers to my daughter and her husband. Effective immediately, and you can add text alerts to every withdrawal. And you can place a no third-party flag on my accounts so that no one can change anything without my voice on the line or my signature in ink. I said it calmly and then I waited while the keyboard clattered like rain on a tin roof, and a printer started up somewhere and the smell of burnt coffee floated through the receiver the way it does in every bank lobby where people come to learn how much order they can afford. He asked me to verify 3 things and then 2 more, and when the forms were ready he said, if you can come in I will have everything waiting. So I put on my blue cardigan and the comfortable flats that mean business and I drove to the branch that has known me since the days when I cashed paper checks with my hair still wet from the sink. The lobby was quiet. A toddler tapped the leg of a chair with a plastic truck, and an older gentleman counted coins into a paper sleeve while the television showed a loop about savings goals. I signed my name 4 times and initialed twice, and Mr. Klein slid a stack of confirmations toward me warm from the tray. He tilted his head and asked gently, is everything all right? And I told him the truth in one line: order is a kindness. He nodded as if we were quoting a scripture we both trusted. When I walked out with my folder, I felt taller by an inch and wider by a rib. I drove home with the radio low and the past week tucked in the glove box where it could not ask for my attention at every stoplight. At the house, I stood on the stoop and looked at the doorknob that has turned for babies with sticky hands and men with callous palms and friends who shouted surprise before I could answer, and I realized I did not know for sure who had keys anymore. So I took a spiral notebook and wrote a title across the top: Keys, and under it I made a list with names and dates: Max, first set at graduation; spare left on my hook one Thanksgiving and never returned; Angela, one copy made after the wedding shower; Evan, never given by me, likely copied; neighbor Eleanor, emergency copy for plants and packages, still on her ring. I drew a small square beside each entry and checked the ones I could confirm and left the rest empty. Then I took a photo of the old deadbolt with my phone like I was documenting a relic before a museum team arrived, and I called the locksmith whose card had lived in a drawer with rubber bands and bread ties for a decade. He said he could come by after lunch. I said I would make coffee. He laughed and said he prefers tea, but he will take the coffee because that is what a house tastes like. While I waited, I set a small tray with cups and sugar, and I walked through the rooms touching the thresholds with my knuckles like a knock you give yourself to be polite. I was at the dining room arch when I heard car doors close in quick succession, 3 of them, a sound like punctuation in a sentence you did not write. I stood very still and listened to the murmur of voices and then the metal whisper of a key that does not belong to a door but tries anyway. When I opened the door, Angela stepped in first with her cardigan falling off one shoulder, Evan right behind her with a jaw like a hinge, and a man in a dark suit whose tie shone like a warning. The living room breathed and then held its breath as if the furniture knew this scene and wished it did not. I said, "You do not enter my home without my invitation," and Angela said, "Mama, we tried to call," and her voice wore its softer coat but her eyes were the same hard gloss as the day before. The man in the suit held out a business card and a smile that did not reach anything inside him. "Good morning, Mrs. Walker. I am Mr. Fisher. We just want to make sure you are managing things and that you have support as needed in this season." The words "I am managing fine" were ready on my tongue, but I swallowed them because fine is a code we use when we want to pivot. Instead I said, "You will leave the papers on the table and keep your hands away from my drawers." He blinked and then stepped to the table anyway and set down a folder, and when he reached toward my mail I moved his hand away without touching him by standing where he wanted to be. "Evan said we are concerned about confusion at your age," and I watched his mouth shape each word like a kindness he thought could pass for concern. I said, "Enunciate all you wish. The meaning is clear. You want access," and Angela said, "It is just a power of attorney so we can help and pay the bills and keep everything smooth." And I looked at the woman who called me mama when help was a bridge she wanted to cross and mother when help was a wall she wanted to break, and I said with a smile as thin as thread, "I have been paying bills since before you were born without handing my signature to anyone. That is a skill I will keep." Mr. Fisher slid one page forward with a pen poised like a dagger that thinks it is a spoon and murmured, "This is standard. It only takes a moment." I reclaimed my own pen from the dish near the lamp and wrote one sentence on my legal pad with letters neat as Sunday gloves. "No signature will be given today." Then I lifted the folder he had brought and closed it and set it back in his hands. The gesture felt like placing a hot pan where it belongs, on its own burner. A low anger moved through me like a tide, but I let it roll back because my house deserved calm. I said, "You are trespassing and this is your notice to leave. The only transition here is yours to the front door." Angela's lips parted like a child caught borrowing a dress, and Evan stared at me with a look I had seen on boys who misjudged their own strength. Mr. Fisher recovered faster than both and offered that low even tone certain men practice in mirrors. "Mrs. Walker, if you refuse reasonable support, your family may be compelled to pursue legal guardianship to ensure your safety." The word guardianship landed on my rug like mud, and I marked the time and the phrasing in my notebook because the future loves exact words. Angela reached out to touch my arm. I stepped back and she looked hurt as if I had struck her. She said, "We are just trying to make sure you do not get taken advantage of," and I said, "I will not be, and I will not allow you to be the ones to do it. Please leave." The locksmith truck pulled up then with a cheerful beep, and a man in a canvas jacket walked in with the authority of someone invited. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I brought the grade 1 deadbolts we discussed." I smiled at him the way relief smiles, bright and grateful. "You are right on time. Our guests were just stepping out." The guests did not wish to step out, but the sight of a drill and a man who knows where to place it gave them a reason to back down gracefully, at least for show. On the porch, Evan leaned toward me as if the air between us belonged to him and said, "This will not go the way you think." I replied in a voice even as a lake, "It will go the way the law thinks," and I closed the door gently because slamming is for people who need noise to feel strong. The first screw bit into the old metal and the sound went through the frame like a tiny hymn. The locksmith talked while he worked. He showed me how the new keys would sit, how the bolts throw further into the jamb, how the plate anchors through the studs. The language was useful and blessedly dull, and I stood there and learned because a woman who can describe how her door holds is a woman who can describe how her life holds. When he finished the first door we moved to the back, and then the side, and when the last lock clicked I felt a looseness behind my ribs I had not felt since the day of the call. He handed me a small envelope with 6 new keys and I wrote down who would get one: myself, Eleanor, church office for emergencies with a log. No one else. I paid in cash and tipped because good work should never go unthanked. When the house was quiet again I made a fresh pot of coffee and sat with my binder and my pen and I called the number on Daniel Weber's card. He picked up on the second ring and I introduced myself and told him in clean lines what had occurred. He did not interrupt. When I finished he said softly, "What you are describing is elder financial abuse in progress and we will move on 2 tracks, protective and documentary. First we secure your accounts and your home. It sounds like you already started that this morning. Then we build a record, every call, every arrival, every phrase like confusion at your age or power of attorney, every attempt to enter, every document you are shown. We keep copies and we date and time and we keep the chain of custody." Clear. He paused and then asked, "Do you have any reason to believe your communications or devices have been tampered with?" I told him about the email that had appeared to go out in my name last month to a buyer that made me look careless. He hummed like a man who recognizes a pattern and said, "We will loop in an IT professional to examine headers and logins. Do not delete anything. We also prepare for a possible wellness check visit from Adult Protective Services. Sometimes when a boundary goes up, the people who want your resources call the state and try to turn your no into a symptom." I wrote the words wellness check in my notebook and underlined them once. Then he said, "I want you to gather 3 things: your bank letters from today, a list of every transfer to your daughter and her husband for the last 3 years with dates and amounts, and any medical notes that confirm your capacity." He asked about my support system and I told him about Eleanor and Sister Bernice and Mr. Green at the pharmacy, who has seen me upright and steady since before Evan could grow a beard. He said community witnesses matter more than people think, and I felt a tenderness for the way survival is made of ordinary eyes that have watched you buy stamps and stand in line. We set a morning appointment and then he added this caution with a care that made it easier to hear. "If anyone arrives with a gentle tone and a clipboard, do not answer questions until I am present. You have the right to counsel even when the visit is framed as care." I thanked him and hung up and placed his card on top of the binder like a small roof over paper that would soon hold weather. The phone rang again with a number I did not know and I let it ring 6 times until it fed itself to silence. I walked to the sink and washed 2 cups and watched the water swirl and thought about all the times I would have filled this same sink with tears in another life. Now it held only light and a little soap. The doorbell rang at 3 and I checked the camera before I opened because cameras are not about fear. They are about respect for your own threshold. It was Eleanor with a foil-covered dish and the look of a woman who brings good food to bad moments. She stepped in and set the casserole on the counter and studied my face and said, "Tell me how it went," without telling me everything, and I said, "The locks are new. The bank is clean. The threats are on paper where they belong." She nodded and touched my elbow the way mothers do when they want you to feel your own backbone. We sat and I told her the short version and she told me a short story of her own from years ago that ended with this sentence: "Boundaries are love with a backbone." I wrote that down and circled it because a phrase that true deserves ink. As the light shifted golden and then thin as a reed, I worked through my receipts and lined up the statements and wrote the dates into the log until the page looked like a small road that knew where it was headed. My phone buzzed once more and this time it was a text from Angela that read, "We are worried and we can come by to talk and bring a friend who knows what to do." I wrote the time beside the words and did not answer because not every question deserves your breath. I stood and stretched and the house answered with those small settling sounds that remind you what is alive. I opened the purse and touched the manila envelope and told it, "We will speak soon." Not in fear, in order, and then I turned toward the hall mirror and saw a woman whose eyes were tired but not dimmed, whose mouth sat in a line that means decision rather than bitterness, and I said to her reflection softly so only we could hear, "You did well today, now rest." And then for the ones listening who know that rest is a rebellion too, I will ask you, has anyone ever called you confused the second you finally said no? If you felt that sting-type truth winds in your heart right now, and tell me your city when you comment. Later, I want to picture your block when I tell the next part. I turned out the light and the new lock answered with a click that sounded like a promise, and in that sound I found relief. Daniel Weber's office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, the kind of clean that says decisions get made here and then hold, and when I sat down across from him he did not start with pity or a slow voice. He started with a yellow pad and a pencil and the sentence, "We are going to give the truth a place to live." I set my folder on his desk and we worked like two people quilting from scraps. He asked for dates, I gave them. He asked for amounts, I read them. He asked for phrases used by Angela and Evan. I repeated them as if I were reciting a short liturgy I wanted never to hear again. Confusion at your age. Just sign so we can help. Small ceremony, only special people. He wrote each down in a neat column and then drew lines to boxes he labeled pressure, access, and smear. We printed my online statements and highlighted every $500 transfer like fence posts across 3 long years. We added furniture receipts and grocery deliveries and gas money notes. We clipped them in order until the binder sat heavy the way a good door sits in its frame. He called his paralegal and asked for a cease and desist template and a preservation of evidence notice to send to their counsel. Then he looked at me over the rim of his glasses and said gently, "We also plan for a wellness check. It may come, it may not. But we plan as if it will. Do you have a primary care note confirming capacity?" I told him I had my last visit summary in a drawer with church bulletins and extra envelopes. He smiled and said, "Bring it this afternoon and we will copy it." He flagged a section of his form and wrote Adult Protective Services on the line in letters the size of a promise and said, "If an investigator arrives, you will call me before you answer even one question. Not because you are hiding, because you are entitled to common counsel." He had a way of speaking that made the air slow down enough for sense to settle, and I felt my shoulders drop a fraction. When we were done, he looked at the clock and said, "The next step is your house and your doors. People think a lock is just metal. A lock is also a statement." I told him the locksmith had finished the first round and that I would add a camera system because paper is good but pictures sing. He nodded. That afternoon I drove to Summer Hardware where the aisles still carry the smell of oil and cardboard, and the owner calls everyone by their last name like a coach who believes you can learn the play. Mr. Summer listened while I described what I needed and then waved his son over from the latter aisle. Ethan arrived with a tablet and a calm smile and talked me through small cameras that blink like quiet stars, a doorbell that records, a cloud backup that sends copies to a vault I can see from my phone. He measured the door trim and the porch angle and the line of the driveway. We picked placements like you choose chairs for a choir, not too many, just enough for harmony. He scheduled the install for the next morning and I bought a little brass plate that reads, "This home is watched." Not because I wanted to frighten anyone, because truth deserves 2 witnesses. When I pulled into my driveway, the evening light lay flat and gold across the porch and I could see the new deadbolts winking the way eyes do when they keep a secret you can trust. I stood on the mat and listened to the house breathe. Then I went to the salon because survival requires more than paperwork. It requires a moment where hands in warm water remind you that your head is still your own. Cynthia saw me in the mirror and clapped softly like a friend at a graduation. "Girl, you look like a woman who remembered her name," she said. She lathered my hair slow. The scent of shampoo like clean linen on a summer line. The dryer hummed, scissors whispered. She told me about her boy in comm unit. Why college, and I told her about a binder that now had a spine. When she turned the chair toward the light, she said, "You look free." I did not argue. I stopped by the pharmacy for vitamins and Mr. Green leaned over the counter with the familiarity of someone who has watched your seasons. He asked after my roses and then lowered his voice to say, "Your daughter asked me some questions last week that did not sit right. About whether you take anything strong. About whether you forget your refills." He shook his head. I told her I sell you aspirin and fish oil and that you pay an exact change and know exactly where you put the receipt. He looked embarrassed as if the truth were somehow impolite. I thanked him and asked if he would write down what he remembered if asked. He said gladly and patted the counter like a pledge. On the way home I passed our church and parked because I needed wood and light and a familiar hush. The sanctuary smelled of lemon oil and old hymnals and Sister Bernice was arranging flowers with her careful hands. She looked up and her smile made room for me. I sat in the third pew as always and told her the short version. Not to stir gossip, to steady my own steps. She folded my fingers into hers and said the sentence I needed. Truth has a way of walking in even when nobody holds the door. We prayed short and clean, no speeches, just thank you for breath and wisdom. I dropped 2 notes for women on our sick list and drove home under a sky that had the soft color of a bruise that is healing. In the morning, Ethan and his tool bag arrived with the sun and set to work. He showed me the app on my phone and how the motion alert looks like a small bell. He aimed one camera toward the porch, one toward the sidewalk, one toward the back gate. He pressed a button and a tiny green light woke up. He had me ring the bell and speak. The speaker carried my voice like a calm teacher. I laughed at the strangeness of hearing myself at my own door and Ethan grinned like a kid who loves his craft. When he left I made toast and sat with my notebook and wrote out a list titled Paper Trail so I would not have to rely on the kind of memory that bends under stress. That afternoon I created a safe place on my computer for files named with dates and plain words, bank_letters, locksmith_invoice, camera_install phone_log. I copied my statements and scanned my receipts and took photos of my ledger pages and stored them twice, once on a drive, once in the cloud. Then I stood and drafted a decoy document the way Daniel had suggested later for a trap I was not yet ready to set but wanted to prepare. A simple budget help note that looked useful but carried a faint signature mark in the footer, and a unique phrase tucked into the metadata. I saved it where curious hands would think they had found something sweet and I did not send it. I closed the laptop and let the screen go dark because restraint is the cousin of wisdom. Around 4 my doorbell chimed and the app showed Eleanor on the porch with a travel mug and a conspirator's smile. She stepped in and handed me coffee with cinnamon and said, "I brought you courage in a cup." Then we sat at the table where so many birthday cakes have cooled and I told her the long version. She listened without interrupting as people do who know the weight of silence. When I finished she said, "Boundaries are love with a backbone. You keep saying that sentence until it fits like a good coat." We planned what to do if Angela came by when I was not home. Eleanor would not engage. She would hand her a card with Daniel's office number and say all communication goes there. We exchanged emergency numbers. We wrote them on a card and taped it inside the pantry so Fine Panic would not have to run around looking for a pencil. Near dusk my phone buzzed and an alert popped up, motion at front door. I glanced at the screen and saw Evan on the step with his shoulders squared, and his hand hovering near the knob and Angela behind him biting her lip. He tried the handle like a man sure he still owned yesterday and found only the present. He bent, peered at the lock, spoke into his phone, pointed. The alert recorded a minute and then another and then they stepped back to the sidewalk and looked up at the house as if it might yield to a long stare. They left and I saved the clip with the date and time and a small note for context. Later that evening an email arrived that appeared to be from me to a buyer I had met last month about a small table I was selling. It included a wrong pickup time and a sentence that made me sound careless. I had not sent it. I checked the header. I took a screenshot. I forwarded it to Daniel with a line that read, "Seems we have creative ghosts." He replied within 10 minutes, "Do not engage, keep copies. We will have our IT person look at your login history tomorrow." I went to bed early with the kind of tired that sits in your bones like a warm weight. At 2 in the morning another alert chimed and I rolled over and looked. A car idled at the curb with its lights low. The camera caught the number of the house across the street reflected on its windshield. A small detail I did not think mattered yet and saved anyway because sometimes justice is a jigsaw and you do not know which piece looks like sky. The next day Daniel's IT colleague met me at the office and walked me through my email security as if we were tightening laces before a walk. She showed me the logins and the odd spike from an old tablet that had sat in a drawer since last fall. She disabled it, reset passwords, added 2-step verification, sent me a neat report that used phrases like unauthorized access attempt and suggested vector. She printed it for the binder and sent a copy to the cloud. On my way home I passed the city park where mothers tuck hair behind small ears and old men play chess, and I let myself sit on a bench for 10 minutes to watch normal things happen. A cardinal hopped along a fence. A boy on a scooter told his grandmother a story with his whole body. My breath remembered how to be gentle. That afternoon I drove to church again to meet Sister Bernice in the fellowship hall. We set out donated pans for the Saturday food pantry and she asked me to check the labels with my good eyes. I told her about the cameras and the email and she nodded in that slow way that means I told you storms come in clusters but roofs were invented for a reason. We laughed softly and folded paper napkins into triangles. When I left the hall Mr. Davis from 2 houses down was standing near the sidewalk pretending to study his mailbox though no one ever writes to him. He frowned at me and said, "Those cameras of yours make the block look like a television show." I smiled and answered without heat, "They make it look like a place where folks mind their own business and respect front doors." He harumphed and turned as if the mail might suddenly appear. I wrote his comment in my log because small complaints sometimes turn into sworn statements and context matters. The week went by in measured steps. Each morning I checked my accounts and my doorbell app. Each afternoon I added whatever the day had handed me to the binder. The act of writing steadied me the way a metronome steadies a choir. Friday evening I was headed home from the grocery store when my phone vibrated with a motion alert, and then another, and then the live view showed Angela and Evan on my porch. With 2 other people I did not know, they rang and knocked and spoke into the doorbell as if it were a person. I did not answer. I called Daniel. He told me to pull into Eleanor's driveway and wait. He called the non-emergency police line and then called me back. "Stay in your car, officers are on the way." The squad car slid to the curb with lights off but presents turned all the way up. 2 officers walked my path as if it were their own front steps and spoke to the group. The taller one pointed at the sign that read property protected and at the doorbell that glowed with its tiny ring of light. He said something firm but not loud and the group retreated like a tide. I watched from the shadow of my friend's oak and felt the strange mix of sadness and relief that comes when you realize family is now just a word you used to use for people who no longer qualify. I saved the clip, I wrote the time. I texted Eleanor a thank you heart and she texted back a small thumbs up. No frills. Just presents. The next morning I dropped by the pharmacy for stamps and Mr. Green leaned forward to tell me. He had drafted a short letter clarifying my medication history in case anyone asked. I thanked him and added it to the binder under community witnesses because a life is built in front of neighbors and those eyes matter. On Sunday I wore my blue dress and sat in the third pew and sang low and steady and let my voice brush the word mercy like a familiar gate. After service Sister Bernice squeezed my hand and said, "Hold your line, goddess." Yes, and paper remembers. By Monday the routine felt like a raft, coffee, check accounts, review app clips, a short walk, a note in the log, a call to Daniel with anything new. That afternoon a thick envelope slid through my mail slot and landed with a sound that made the house stiffen. I opened it with the letter opener my husband gave me on our 10th anniversary and found a petition for guardianship with my name in bold where my life should be. I sat for one breath and then another, then I wrote the time and called Daniel. He said we knew this might come, now we move from preparation to action. He asked me to bring the envelope and the little details that give a judge a real picture. The video of the doorknob testing, the email spoof, the bank confirmations, the note from Mr. Green, the camera timestamps, the log of quotes like confusion at your age. And while I gathered those pieces the cameras caught a quiet thing that became a loud thing later. Evan dropped a letter at my door. With a tone that tried to sound kind and reasonable and said please call so we can make this easier. I photographed it. I put it in a plastic sleeve. I made tea. I sat at the table and breathed 5 deep breaths because a steady voice is a gift you give yourself. Then I stood and looked out the window at the street where children learn to ride and teens learn to wave at elders, and I thought about the simple promise I had made the first night after the call, to move forward with dignity and let the record do the shouting. The investigation part of my story did not feel like television. It felt like laundry hung in order, one shirt, one sheet, one towel, each clipped, each drying in the honest air. By dusk my binder had grown to a size that could stand on its own and I whispered to it, "You are my witness." And to myself I said softly, "You are not alone. Not with locks that hold, neighbors who see, a church that prays, and a lawyer who knows where the light switch is." When I turned off the kitchen lamp the new deadbolt answered with a clean click and the camera blinked once like a small star keeping watch. The night felt less like a hole and more like a roof. I woke before sunrise to the soft blue light that makes a kitchen feel like it is thinking, opened my notebook, and wrote at the top of a fresh page the words "controlled fire." Then I laid out the pieces Daniel and I had discussed and began building the honey trap as calmly as a woman sets bread to rise. No rush, no noise, just steps you can trust. I opened a blank document and titled it Budget Help Notes so it would look harmless. Inside I typed simple language about how an older parent might divide monthly expenses with an adult child while setting boundaries, nothing that could hurt me if it leaked. Then I threaded a thin signature line into the footer that only Daniel and I would recognize. I placed a phrase near the bottom that was unique enough to spot anywhere it traveled. Something like "order is a kindness," written exactly as I had whispered to myself in the bank. And I saved the file in a folder on my desktop labeled House Papers where any curious person would be tempted to dig. I did not send it to anyone. I did not even email it to myself. I closed the lid and stood by the window sipping coffee while the sky shifted from early pewter to pale gold. My doorbell camera pinged once with a passing dog walker and then settled. At 10:30 I opened the laptop again and moved the decoy to a more obvious place. The kind of place a careless intruder might believe was a secret stash, a folder called Taxes Old. Then I took a slow breath and left the house for a walk. Because traps do not spring faster if you stare at them. I looped the block twice, waved at Mrs. Powell watering her geraniums, and returned to a small tremor of activity. My phone chimed, motion at side gate. The clip showed the neighbor boy tossing a basketball that thudded off the fence. Nothing more. I put laundry in the machine and hummed to him under my breath. Just after noon I heard the faint whir of a printer from the mailroom alcove near the apartment lobby around the corner. A sound I would never have noticed before cameras taught me to hear small things. 5 minutes later my email chimed with a message that looked like it had been forwarded through a strange path. A free account with a name that could be anyone. It quoted a line from my decoy and asked for clarification on a budget schedule. The subject matched the exact title of my file. My heart ticked twice and then smoothed. I took screenshots of the header. I saved the message. I did not reply. At 2 my doorbell. Camera caught Evan walking fast with a manila page tucked under his arm and his eyes fixed on anywhere but the lens. Angela trailed behind him with her mouth set the way you do when you believe the ground should do as it is told. They did not knock. They moved past to the lobby, the printer noise returned. The trap had been tasted and I felt a quiet satisfaction that was not mean. It was relief that my preparation had weight. I called Daniel and told him the sequence. He said, "Good, send me the screenshots and the clip. We will preserve metadata and file a notice that any use of false documents will be treated as interference and that all electronic activity related to your accounts is to be held for review." He asked if I was ready for the next move, a cease and desist. I said yes. That night he emailed a letter for me to read that used clean language like stop attempts to access systems property and medical narratives, and another letter to opposing counsel that asked for preservation of devices that may have accessed my accounts. The next morning the letters went out by courier and by email. By afternoon a reply arrived from a new attorney who said he represented Angela and Evan. The tone tried to sound concerned while wearing a coat of threat. He wrote that my recent behavior suggests cognitive decline and that my neighbors and even my pharmacist had noticed paranoia. He requested that I submit to an evaluation and asked for a list of all passwords so my family could provide assistance. I read it twice, wrote the line in my log, and forwarded it to Daniel, who responded with 3 words, "Hold your line." A small hour later my doorbell rang and my phone displayed an unfamiliar woman in a neat blazer holding a folder. I opened the audio and she introduced herself as Ms. Kayla Schmidt from Adult Protective Services. Her voice was soft and official, and she asked if she could come in to conduct a wellness check based on concerns reported by family members. A cord tightened in my chest because Daniel had warned me and now the warning had put on shoes. I thanked her for coming and told her I would be happy to speak when my attorney was present. She tilted her head and used the old sentence, "If you have nothing to hide." I repeated my line with a steady tone. "I am entitled to counsel and calm. Please wait while I call." Daniel answered on the second ring and said he was 15 minutes away. Ms. Schmidt stood on the porch reading her form and tapping a box with her pen as if impatience could make paper say something it did not say. Daniel arrived in a dark suit with a binder under his arm, and we invited her into the living room where the afternoon light turned the dust into bright specks like tiny witnesses. She asked structured questions in a voice that made me think of checklist training. "Do you manage your own finances?" "Yes, and here are the statements." "Do you live alone?" "Yes, and here are the locks and the security system." "Documentation?" "Do you take any medication that impacts your memory?" "No, and here is a letter from my physician noting full capacity and good cognitive function for my age." She asked if I had isolated from family. I answered that I attend church twice weekly, meet with neighbors, and have a standing salon appointment. Daniel slid over affidavits from Eleanor and Sister Bernice attesting to my daily function and consistent routines. He placed Mr. Green's draft letter on the coffee table and said, "The pharmacist will finalize this today." Ms. Schmidt read each page carefully and her shoulders softened as the story on paper overtook the story in rumor. She asked to look around the home and I walked her through the kitchen with its labeled jars, the calendar with appointments, the tidy bedroom with clean laundry folded at the foot. We returned to the sofa and she closed her folder. "I see no immediate risk," she said. "I will review with my supervisor. But this appears to be a matter of family conflict and finances outside our scope." She stood, thanked us, and left with a face that looked both relieved and slightly annoyed that her day had been borrowed by someone else's agenda. When the door shut, I exhaled a long, slow breath that trembled at the end, and Daniel said that tremble is the body letting go of weight. "Drink some water." Then he pointed to the binder and said, "RN. XT move is the temporary restraining order for your property. The doorknob testing and the late-night idling and the email spoof combine into a pattern of access pressure. The judge will see it." We filed the motion that afternoon with clips and timestamps and the polite language that courts prefer. The clerk stamped a hearing date and a judge approved a temporary order pending the hearing. A sign went up at my gate noting the order number, and the simple words "Private property, no contact." Without counsel, the effect was immediate and strange. The air on my porch felt taller, as if the house had stood to its full height. That evening I walked the hallway and touched each new lock like the head of a child you pray for. Then I sat at my table and wrote in my notebook the sentence, "Justice is a long song. Sing your note and let the choir carry the rest." Early the next morning the printer in the lobby sang again, and my camera caught Evan collecting pages with a quick check over his shoulder. Minutes later the burner account sent a fresh email referencing my decoy file again, but this time quoting the unique phrase we had planted. "Order is a kindness." My trap had grown teeth. I saved it and sent it to Daniel, who forwarded it to his forensic colleague. A reply came back that metadata indicated the file had been opened from a device that had accessed my network through an old guest password. We added that to the timeline. At noon the new attorney sent another message with a Softer tone, he proposed a family meeting to resolve confusion and reminded us that guardianship was an available tool to protect loved ones. Daniel replied that all communication would proceed through counsel, and that any further attempts to access devices or accounts would be addressed by the court. I made soup to steady my hands and carried a bowl to Eleanor, who was trimming her rosebush. We ate on her porch and she told me a short story about her cousin who learned to say no by writing it on a sticky note and keeping it on the fridge. She said, "Keep yours where you can see it." That night the doorbell chimed and the camera showed Angela alone, bare-faced and tired. She spoke into the speaker, "Mama, please talk to me." I held my breath and then pressed the button and answered with care. "Communication goes through Daniel Weber now." She touched her throat and said, "They are telling the world you are not well." I said, "I am fine and I wish you a peaceful night." She stepped back, looked at the sign with the order number, and walked away with a little tilt that made my heart ache and harden at the same time. 2 days later Miss Schmidt returned with a slimmer folder and said, "I am closing this case." She had a paper for me to sign acknowledging her visit and I signed. Then she thanked me for my patience and said quietly, "I see families use us to pressure their elders more often than I like." I told her I was grateful and she smiled, in that way people do when they have done the right thing and their day might finally break in their favor. I watched her car roll away and let the relief settle into the soles of my feet. By late afternoon the block knew something had shifted. Mr. Davis muttered to his azaleas about ladies with cameras and lawyers, and Eleanor called across the fence that she was bringing macaroni and cheese. Sister Bernice stopped by after choir rehearsal and stood on my porch with 3 other churchwomen who bowed their heads while she prayed a short porch prayer for clarity and peace, their amen lifted like a warm cloth laid over a restless child. That night my phone vibrated with an alert, "Motion at front walk." I looked and saw Angela and Evan with 2 men I did not recognize. They gestured at the sign, rang the bell, and spoke into the speaker with pressed voices. I stayed in the car at the curb, called Daniel, then dialed the non-emergency line. The officers who arrived enforced the order with firm courtesy. A small crowd of porch watchers appeared, as they always do when something bright happens on an otherwise quiet street. The men left, Evan glaring at the lens, Angela crying in a way that sounded more tired than dramatic. I saved the clip and closed my eyes for a moment in the parked car, feeling both steadied and bruised. The next morning Mr. Green handed me his finalized letter at the counter. He explained how Angela had asked questions and how he had felt uneasy. He apologized for any confusion and affirmed with specifics that my purchases had been vitamins and aspirin and the occasional throat lozenge. I put the letter in the binder and thanked him with a grace that felt new in my mouth, grace that leaves room for people to make it right. By evening Daniel texted me a photo of a stamped filing time stamped by the court. The guardianship petition had officially been submitted against me. The line on my spine turned to steel and a surprising calm spread through my chest like warm tea. The trap had done its work. The smear had reached for an official seal. The wellness check had closed on our side. The police had documented the order. The neighbors had seen what they had seen. And the paper sang. In bed I lay on my side and watched the faint green ring of the doorbell reflect on the ceiling like a tiny planet and told myself one last sentence before sleep found me. I will meet them where truth lives and I will keep my seat. Morning came with that calm sky that looks like a washed plate. And before the kettle finished its soft hiss, a knock sounded that was not a knock at all but a careful rhythm. When I opened the door, Miss Kayla Schmidt stood there again with a slimmer folder and a face that had already decided something. I invited her into the front room where the sun warmed the framed photo of Robert in his church suit. She sat, flattened one palm on the folder, and said she had completed her review. She had spoken with her supervisor, she had checked my physician letter and the affidavits and the security clips and the bank alerts and the neat calendar that shows a life in motion. And she was closing the case today and would be filing a note that there was no indication of risk or incapacity. She said the words in that official tone that does not usually carry kindness, yet they felt kind this time, like a door unlocked from the inside. She asked me to sign a simple acknowledgement. I signed, and she stood and hesitated and then told me quietly that sometimes family reports are really leverage and that this one had that smell. I thanked her for saying it out loud. She touched my shoulder as a woman does when she knows what it costs to hold a line. And then she left. The screen door made its small spring noise and the house breathed in. I texted Daniel the result and he replied with a thumbs up and 2 words well timed. I put the signed page into the binder and sat for a minute with the good stillness that follows a clean decision. It did not last long. By mid-afternoon my camera lit my phone with a frame that looked like a scene from a neighborhood play. Angela and Evan walked up flanked by 2 men who carried themselves like friends who believe they are necessary. They paused at the little plastic sleeve that held the order number at my gate. Their eyes moved from the paper to the lens and back again. The bell chimed and the speaker crackled as Angela said, "Mama, we just want to talk." Evan added, "We brought witnesses so nobody can twist anything." I sat in my car along the curb like Daniel, and I had planned for such a moment because safety sometimes looks like distance. I called his number and then tapped the non-emergency line. The officers arrived with polite faces and clipped radios. They spoke to the group, checked the order on the cruiser computer, and explained that they were in violation of the temporary order if they remained. A few neighbors drifted to porches because human attention is a tide. Mr. Davis pretended to deadhead his azaleas while turning his head just enough to catch every word. Eleanor stood by her steps, arms folded in quiet support. One of the officers asked if I wished to remain unseen or approach. Daniel was still on the phone in my ear saying, "Keep your seat. Let the paper speak." I stayed in the car and watched as the officers guided them back to the sidewalk. Angela protested that she was a daughter, not a trespasser. Evan asked the officers if they understood that older people get confused and that it would be better to let him collect documents before things got worse. The officer pointed at the order again, neutral and precise, and told them to contact my counsel if they had legitimate business. A low cheer rose from down the block where 3 boys had set up a milk crate as a makeshift hoop. Not because they cared about me or Angela or any legal word, but because a bright moment had broken the afternoon. Angela wiped her face, looked at my window with a pain that pricked me even from the car, and then they all retreated to the curb where Van spoke into his phone with sharp gestures that looked like the angry flight of a trapped bird. The cruisers idled a minute longer and then rolled away. Quiet returned as if someone had turned a knob. I stepped from the car. Eleanor crossed the grass with a foil-covered pan and the familiar soft laugh of a woman who knows how to comfort without asking for a long story. She pressed the warm weight into my hands and said, "Macaroni and cheese forgives many days." I told her I would return the dish. She said, "Keep it as long as you need." Sister Bernice arrived 20 minutes later with 2 choir ladies who looked like every good Sunday I have ever known. They formed a circle on my porch without ceremony, heads bowed, and Sister Bernice prayed a short prayer for clarity, peace, and right order. No thunder language, just clear words that straighten the inside of a person. When they finished, I felt the way a sheet feels when you pull it smooth across a bed. Even ready, and then we sat a while. And they told small stories about little victories. A grandbaby who finally slept through the night, a niece who got her certificate, a neighbor whose doctor finally listened. Their voices were the sound of community stitching a tear. The next day I took a walk to the pharmacy for toothpaste and to return a bottle of lotion that had a scent I could not warm to. Mr. Green looked up the moment the bell on the door chimed and motioned me to the corner where school supplies sit during late summer. His face held that mixture of apology and urgency that says a truth wants out. He told me he had finalized his letter for Daniel, that he regretted the confusion, and that when Angela had asked about my medication he had tried to be helpful but now understood how information can be shaped. He slid the signed affidavit across the counter and I read the neat lines that confirmed my purchases: vitamins and aspirin, occasional cough drops, no prescriptions, no irregular behavior. I thanked him and said I valued any man who could say I was wrong and I am making it right. He nodded and said his mother taught him that a correction is better than a defense. I walked home through the thin slice of shade that a sycamore throws across the sidewalk and felt the strength of small honest acts. At my kitchen table I dated the letter and tucked it into the binder under a tab marked Community. Then I opened my notebook and wrote logs continue. Because the paper flood must be steady, I wrote down each drive-by captured by the camera timestamp, each phone call from numbers I did not know, each email that used the phrase "concern for your safety," each gossip report Eleanor passed along with a face that asked me not to mind the human habit of talking. I did not answer provocation, I did not chase rumors, I added to the record so a tired judge one day could see a straight line through a messy story. 2 evenings later the doorbell rang again and the camera showed Angela alone in a hoodie she would never have worn last year. She spoke into the mic and told me soft things about missing Sunday dinners and how the rent was coming due and how Evan had a plan. I pressed the button and said in a voice that tried to hold compassion and boundary in one hand that all communication must go through counsel and that I wished her a calm night. She swallowed and said nothing and walked away. I went to church the next afternoon for food pantry packing and found that my private mess had become neighborhood vocabulary in the way private messes often do. 2 women from the back row hugged me a beat too long and told me they were praying. A deacon told me the police did right because orders mean safety for everybody. And Sister Bernice whispered that people can try to shame your boundaries by calling them cold. Do not let them. It is not cold to close a door that must be closed. Later that week Daniel called with a tone that said now the next shoe. He told me the guardianship petition had been served and docketed. He told me the plaintiffs had attached a witness statement from Mr. Davis that claimed I had become hostile and brought strangers to the block at all hours. He told me they had included a short note from a clinician who never examined me stating that my refusal to submit to an evaluation suggested cognitive concern. He told me that these things looked sturdy until you touched them, and that we would touch each one with receipts, affidavits, and time-stamped clips. He asked if I wanted to seek a public statement. I said no, I would let the official things speak in official rooms. But he suggested one piece of sunlight, a letter to the building residents reminding them that security cameras protect all of us, that any trespass is documented, and that residents can request footage if they have a safety concern. I liked that. It was service without theater. We drafted the note and slid copies under doors. Gratitude came back in a little wave. A young father knocked to say thank you. An older woman left a peach cobbler on my mat with a note that said, "For your strength." Even Mr. Davis muttered that a camera is fine if it keeps the porch pirates away. The next morning I woke to 57 new emails because a burner account had decided to be busy at 3 in the morning. The subject line bounced between "help us please" and "your lawyer is stealing from you." I did not answer any of them. I put them into a folder and printed the header of the first and last and wrote a line in the log that the volume of communication had increased the day after we notified neighbors about cameras. Daniel called it unsophisticated pressure and told me to keep still. The county clerk posted the hearing date and Eleanor brought over her church fan for me to practice breathing with because sometimes you need something to do with your hands that is not fighting. That weekend the community showed itself the way a quilt shows the hands that made it. Casserole dishes arrived. Small cash envelopes arrived for the pantry with notes that said use where needed. A teen from up the block offered to mow my little patch of lawn. I took the kindness and paid him fairly because charity is not the only way to teach dignity. Sunday service was full. The hymn rose and carried me, and after the benediction a woman I only knew by sight pressed my fingers and said, "My mother went through what you are going through, and we lost a lot before we learned how to hold the line. You are teaching the rest of us how to stand without shouting." I walked home in that slow hot sweetness that summer pours on old neighborhoods, set the binder on the table, and breathed in the lemon oil that Sister Bernice had brought to polish the wood earlier in the week. The phone rang again before sunset. A different officer this time, asking if everything was all right because someone had called to report an elderly woman in distress at my address. I told him I was knitting and listening to a baseball game on the radio and that my distress level was low. He laughed and said he would note the false report and add it to the file. He said this happens sometimes when people think the uniform can be used like a stick. I thanked him for the professionalism and wrote one sentence in the log about the welfare call. The next day Mr. Green stopped me on the sidewalk as I passed and handed me a second note in case the court wanted something more detailed. He had listed the dates Angela visited, and the questions she asked and the exact answers he gave. I put it in the binder under a new tab detailed. Daniel emailed to say he had received opposing counsel's subpoena requests for my bank passwords. He replied with a simple refusal and a citation and then sent me a copy so I could see good boundaries in legal language. He asked if I wanted to attend a community forum at the church about elder safety that Sister Bernice and Eleanor had proposed. I said yes because public education is not the same as public fighting. The forum took place on a Wednesday evening. A dozen people sat in a circle and shared a little and listened a lot. Daniel explained the difference between help and control and what guardianship is supposed to be for and how often it is misused. Eleanor read a short piece about boundaries as love with a backbone, and I spoke late in the hour with my voice steady. I did not name names. I did not tell our whole story. I told the room what paper can do when gossip runs fast and what a lock can do when history knocks hard. Heads nodded. A man at the back wiped his eyes. And when the prayer closed the forum, a sound of chairs sliding and people exhaling at the same time filled the hall. I walked home under the streetlights feeling that the private pain had been folded into something the community could hold. The binder felt lighter in my bag as if many hands were underneath it now. That night as I laid out clothes for the hearing day and placed my folded list of points into the inside POC ket of my jacket, I wrote one more sentence on a small card and taped it inside the front door where I would see it on my way out. It said, "They chose noise, you chose notes, keep your seat." And with that the public path into the courtroom felt less like a march and more like a measured walk toward a table where truth had been patiently waiting with its folder open. The courthouse smelled like cool stone and fresh paper, and the air felt the way a church feels before the first song, measured and watchful. I arrived early with Daniel and sat on a wooden bench that had the polish of other lives. I rested my hands on the binder and whispered the hymn I sing when I need my spine to remember itself. When the clerk called our case, the room shifted forward a fraction. Judge Miller entered with a gaze that landed on everything without hurry. We stood and then sat. And the small scrape of chairs sounded like a single file line of pencils. The judge reviewed the docket and asked counsel to state appearances. Daniel spoke first in that steady voice that never rushes even when the other side runs. Evan's attorney stood and said his name with the pride of a man who believes law is a game you win by speaking loudly. Angela sat beside him with a tissue in her fist. Evan leaned back and watched me the way a person watches a safe they want to open. The judge nodded and said we would proceed in order and reminded everyone that guardianship is extreme relief and that the law requires clear and convincing proof of incapacity. He asked opposing counsel for an opening. They rose and painted their picture. A mother sliding into confusion, sudden financial changes, new locks and cameras, a daughter and son-in-law worried about safety, concerned neighbors, a refusal to cooperate with an evaluation. Words like isolation and undue influence laid out like glass on a table. It was a tidy narrative, practiced, easy to believe if you never touched it. Daniel stood for our turn and said very little. He promised the court receipts and witnesses and a simple question at the heart of the case. Is this woman unable to manage her life or is she choosing to protect it? The judge inclined his head and called for the first witness. They started with Angela. She walked to the stand like she had been carrying a bag of rocks for a mile. She swore the oath with a voice that shook and sat and looked down at her folded hands. The attorney asked about my supposed decline and she told small stories with edges sanded down. She said I forgot dates and misplaced keys and repeated questions, and she described the day I installed cameras as the day she lost her mother to fear. She said a clinician they consulted believed I might be in early decline though he had not examined me yet because I refused. When the lawyer asked how this made her feel, she said, helpless and frightened, and then she cried. It was quiet in the room in that way a room gets when tears do their work. Daniel rose and walked to the lectern with a legal pad that had one line on it and asked his first question. Ms. Walker, when was the last time you called your mother and did not ask for money or access or a signature? Angela blinked at him and said she could not remember the exact date. He asked her to name the last conversation that was only about my health or my joy or something small like a recipe. She said she had been busy and that life is complicated. He nodded and then asked if she and Evan had entered my home without permission. She said we were worried and needed to check on things and asked if Daniel knew what it is to love a parent who is slipping. He asked again, did you have permission? She said no. He asked if she told me I was not special when she married in private, and she flinched and said those words were out of context. He asked what context makes them suitable. She said silence. He asked if she believed a 71-year-old woman who cancels automatic transfers and adds locks is confused or careful. She said it felt like rejection. He asked again, is it confusion or a boundary? She did not answer cleanly. He thanked her and sat. The attorney called Mr. Davis next. He testified that I had become unfriendly, that strangers came at all hours, that the street was different now. Daniel asked the neighbor if he had ever spoken to me directly. He said no. Daniel asked if he knew the names of the strangers. He said no. Daniel asked if he knew that the church ladies brought casseroles on Wednesdays, if the tech named Ethan installed cameras by appointment, if the security notice had been provided to all residents. Mr. Davis said he had not read those notices because he does not like paperwork. Daniel sat. They called a clinician who had never met me. He testified that refusal to be evaluated can be consistent with decline. Daniel asked whether refusal can also be consistent with autonomy when a person has counsel and a documented plan of care. The clinician agreed that it can. Daniel asked whether any doctor who has actually examined me had expressed concern. The clinician said he had no such reports. They called Evan and he did what men like Evan do. He wore a tight suit and a brave jaw and told the court that I was erratic and that my new friends isolated me from family, and that my lawyer is manipulating me for fees. Daniel asked him if he had ever paid a utility bill in my name. He said no. Asked if he had ever held a power of attorney for me. He said no. Asked if he currently needed my money to pay his rent. He sighed and said that was not the issue. Asked if he had taken a decoy document and printed it at 1 in the morning. Evan said no until Daniel put a page on the overhead and showed the print log and the watermark in the camera still that caught a man carrying a manila sheet. Evan stared at the image the way a child watches a door close and does not know what to do with his hands. Daniel sat and the judge wrote a note and then said defense may proceed. Daniel called Mr. Green and the pharmacist told the truth with that crisp conscience that makes a room steadier. He explained that Angela had asked about my medicine and that he had signed a vague statement he now regrets and that he had prepared a corrected affidavit. Daniel called Ms. Kayla Schmidt and she confirmed that Adult Protective Services had closed the case with no risk noted. She explained that documentation and community function were strong and that she saw no need for further action. Daniel called Dr. Moore and she took the oath and laid out the evaluation she performed. memory tests, executive function, financial problem solving, orientation and recall. She said my scores were above average for my age. She looked at the judge and said plainly that I am fully capable of making my own decisions. Then Daniel asked Eleanor to testify, and she told the court about the evenings on my porch, about my routine of cooking and walking and packing pantry boxes, about the way I take notes and keep appointments and show up for the quiet work that keeps a person whole. He asked Sister Bernice to speak, and she did not preach. She told a single story about the day I sat in the church office and made a list of Medicare dates and tax days and the times I serve on the pantry line. She said order is a kindness, and that I had kept my order. Then Daniel called me. I stood and made my way to the stand and placed my palm on the Bible and said I do with a voice that did not tremble. I looked at the judge, not at Angela, and told the truth in the first person like a diary spoken out loud. I told the court about the phone call when I learned I was not invited, and the rent I had paid and the furniture I had bought and the groceries I had delivered, and I described the smell of burnt coffee at the bank when I canceled the transfers and the small click of the new lock and the way the camera light blinked like a firefly. I told them I chose to write things down because people forget their own stories when they are ashamed, and that paper does not forget. I told them I set a trap because gossip was loud and I needed proof to stand taller than rumor. I said I am not confused, I am careful, I am not isolated, I am selective. I am not declining, I am deciding. I paused, then said the line that has carried me across the worst days. I am a person, not an ATM with feelings. I explained that the locks were not walls but doors that now open and close on my terms. I told the room that my anger cooled when I started to structure it and that my boundaries saved me from 1,000 loud choices. Opposing counsel rose for cross and tried to make me small. He asked how many times I called my daughter in the last month, and I said none because all communication goes through counsel during litigation. He asked if I had always been obedient to doctors, and I said I have always been loyal to my own conscience. He asked if my neighbor circle influenced me, and I said community is not control and that PLE who feed you and pray with you and laugh on your porch are not handlers. He asked if my lawyer told me what to say, and I smiled and said Daniel reminds me to breathe and to tell the truth. The judge asked a few questions of his own, and they were the kind of questions a fair man asks when he wants to see the foundation under the house. He asked how I manage bills, and I described my calendar, my autopay receipts, my reconciled statements. He asked how I handle health care, and I described my physician, my advance directive, my emergency contact list. He asked about my day, and I told him I walk, I cook, I serve, I read, I rest. He thanked me and said I could step down. We took a short break, and in the corridor I passed Angela by the water fountain, and for a breath we were just mother and daughter near a cold metal basin. She opened her mouth and then closed it. I nodded and kept walking because a hallway is not a healing place, and today was about law, not sentiment. When we returned, the judge invited closings. Opposing counsel stood and delivered a speech about love and fear and how families should not be torn by paperwork. He said change is sudden in the elderly and that my new habits were signs of collapse, not caution. He said people on fixed incomes are vulnerable to exploitation by professionals. He said words that float well in rooms where nobody has held a ledger or a lock. Daniel rose with his 2 pages and gave the quietest closing I have ever seen. He said, guardianship is a tool for those who cannot manage their lives. He said the evidence showed a woman who manages hers. He said the plaintiffs had presented not medical proof but personal disappointment. He said paper beats gossip and order beats accusation. He said autonomy is not isolation and boundary is not decline. He sat. The judge removed his glasses and looked at us over the rims, and the room leaned as if listening could pull the words closer. He spoke slowly like a man laying bricks. He said the law sets a high bar for guardianship and that bar had not been reached. He said the independent evaluation showed full capacity. He said Adult Protective Services closed its file with no concern. He said the decoy document and print logs raised credibility questions about the motives of those who sought control. He said the court denies the petition. He said more. He said that those who misrepresent facts to gain control of an elder's finances come close to exploitation, and that if there is any further harassment or violation of orders, this court will consider sanctions. He said, Ms. Walker, you have the right to live as you see fit and to protect your property with lawful measures and to decide who has access to your life and when. The gavel did not slam. It landed like a soft drum, breath released across the benches. I closed my eyes for 1 second and felt the answer of a dozen quiet prayers. Daniel squeezed my shoulder and said one word finally. The clerk moved on to the next case and we stepped into the hall where life comes back to its usual volume. Evan glared the way a man glares when the door he wanted is now a wall. Angela stared at the floor and touched the tissue to the corner of her eye, and for one moment the girl she used to be looked up through the woman she had become. I did not gloat, I did not comfort. I walked past with steady steps because dignity is also direction. Outside the courthouse the sun was the honest kind of bright that does not hide anything, and the heat rose off the steps and a bus sighed at the curb and a pigeon strutted with unreasonable confidence. Daniel laughed at the bird and then turned to me and outlined what comes next. A permanent restraining order hearing if they keep circling. A letter to the bank noting the denial. A brief to request fees if they file in bad faith again. We stood there in our weekday clothes looking like two ordinary people. And I felt the extraordinary settle into the ordinary the way dawn settles into morning. And because I had promised myself to speak to the folks who keep my stories alive, I whispered across the lens of my own mind the smallest aside. If you have ever had to win your own freedom the hard way, tell me where you are listening from and know I am proud of you. Daniel drove me home and Eleanor met us on the porch with glasses of iced tea and the long relief laugh of a woman who stayed up late praying. We sat in the shade and let the afternoon carry us. The binder sat on the table inside like a faithful dog that has done its job. I thought of the first day of this long path when a sentence cut me like a paper slice and I smiled without bitterness. Justice had not come with thunder, it had come with paper and patience and the small bravery of showing up again and again until the truth stood by itself. When the streetlights blinked on, I stood and locked my door, and the click was not a fear sound anymore. It was a promise. Tomorrow I would fold this day into the story of a woman who chose order over chaos and dignity over noise, and found that a judge will sometimes see what a mother has always known about herself, that she is able and she is steady and she is free. The morning after court I set the binder on the dining table and reached for the old manila envelope I had carried in my purse for months. The paper felt soft from being handled and the flap lifted with a sigh like a page turning in a church hymnal. Inside were deeds and a single letter Robert had written in his steady hand years ago. He had tucked it away for the day I would need not comfort but clarity. I read it again to be sure my memory had not gilded it. He told me that he had consolidated our properties in a holding company and that for reasons of privacy he had kept the structure simple and quiet. He wrote that he trusted my judgment and that if hard times came I should use the assets to protect my peace and to serve the people I loved in ways that keep them honest. I closed my eyes and breathed. Then I called Daniel and asked him to bring the final transfer packet we had prepared during the long weeks of waiting. By noon it lay beside fresh coffee and 2 cups. At 2 o'clock Angela knocked and stood in the doorway with a cautious look that reminded me of the girl who waited for permission before stepping on a polished floor. "Come in, baby," I said. We sat and for a long moment listened to the house breathe. I slid the envelope and the deeds across the table and told her what her father had done and what I had finished. "Yes, I own the building you lived in. Yes, the beach house is back in my name. Yes, the company has enough cushion to cover a storm." She pressed her lips together as if holding back the years between us and said, "Why did you not tell me?" I answered, "Because you needed to meet the truth without a cushion first. I could have rescued you with money on the second day, but it would not have rescued you from yourself." She nodded and tears shone without falling. Then I laid out the choice I had already chosen for both of us. I told her I was converting her old unit into a mentorship apartment for women stepping away from financial abuse. Simple rooms, clean sheets, a stocked pantry, a short-term lease with dignity and rules that feel like kindness. I told her she was welcome to live with me for a season and contribute to expenses and to house chores while she studied and worked. Or if she preferred independence, she could sign a modest lease in a smaller unit at fair market with a written plan that we would build together. Either way, no more hidden money. Every agreement in writing. Her face relaxed in relief that was half sorrow and half respect. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered, "not for the apartment, for the order." I smiled because order is a kind of love. That evening we went to the church office and sat with Sister Bernice and drafted a small program on one sheet. Porch meals on Thursdays, pantry boxes for new tenants, a list of free clinics, a simple calendar for budget classes. We kept it plain on purpose, paper that looked like it could be kept on a refrigerator with a magnet. The next day I met with Daniel and signed the documents to place the holding company into a protective trust. We added a mission clause that reserved 1 floor for elder safety and for women rebuilding after betrayal. I signed my name slowly and felt each letter anchor a long prayer. When we left the courthouse annex, the sun had that warm city shine on brick and glass, and I thought about how a life becomes new the way a window becomes clear when you wipe it with patience. A week later the locksmith returned to install 2 more deadbolts on the ground floor, and Ethan adjusted the camera angles so the walkway and gate were covered cleanly. Then I walked the hall with a clipboard and a small bell in my chest. It is a feeling you get when you are on your own feet and your steps sound like your name. Angela started her classes at the community college. She kept the night job 3 evenings a week. Every morning before she left, she put a folded receipt on the counter labeled groceries or gas or rent share, and the tiny ritual was more healing than any bouquet. One Saturday we took the truck to the farmer's market and filled the bed with donated produce. Back at the building we set a long table on the back lot and Eleanor brought lemon cake and the choir ladies brought casseroles with foil lids and we fed tenants and neighbors and laughed the way folks laugh. When new safety lets shoulders drop, Mr. Davis watched from his porch and at last tipped his cap and said the chicken was good. That was apology enough. Later that afternoon Angela and I sat on the stoop and watched the last plastic chair wobble as a teenager dragged it back inside. Angela said I used to think money fixes money problems and love fixes love problems and now I see respect fixes both. I nodded and kept my eyes on the street where children chalked crooked sons. A few days after that, the mail brought the final court order denying guardianship and a thin envelope with a notice of fees the judge had awarded to my side because of the petitioner's conduct. I set it under a magnet on the fridge next to a photo of Robert at the beach house with a straw hat shoved too low. That night I finally slept the sleep that feels like a deep lake with no weeds. In the morning I woke with a plan for the beach house that had ripened inside me without noise. Angela and I drove down with a bucket of paint chips and a tape measure. The porch board still held the print of Robert's careful hands. We walked room to room and spoke out loud the names of women we knew who would one day rest here between ending and beginning. We kept the kitchen simple and sturdy. We wrote on a notepad towels and lamps and a lockbox for keys. By noon a little wind had started and gulls argued like gossiping cousins, and I stood on the porch and thanked my husband under my breath for the kind of foresight that wears work boots not crowns. When we got home Eleanor was waiting with a stack of applications for the mentorship unit. She had already told 3 quiet stories over parlor rails and now she told them again at our table. A retired school bus driver whose niece had emptied her account. A widow who needed 2 paychecks to stand upright. A woman my age who had been told by her own son she was confused when she told him no. I listened and did not harden. I held the soft part and the strong part at the same time. We picked the first 2 tenants and wrote welcome on 2 index cards with the move-in date. That evening I sent Daniel a note to coordinate the lease and to confirm that every protection we could lawfully use was in place. As I pressed send I felt the steady click that has become my new music. The click of action that is clean. A week turned into 2 and then a month in the building learned our new rhythms. Thursday porch meals. Saturday budget class in the laundry room. Sunday afternoon naps like quiet sermons. Angela journaled at the table some mornings and sometimes she slid a page toward me and asked if a sentence sounded like truth. She wrote about the night she came home from Europe and the day she cleaned offices for the first time and the way Mrs. Johnson told her that dignity is a coat you can wear even when it rains. She wrote about standing in a courtroom and seeing her mother steady herself on the truth. When she looked up from those pages I saw a woman I could walk beside, not a girl I needed to carry. One warm evening Eleanor hosted us all in the courtyard and surprised me with a small plaque made by a neighbor who works in a school shop. The thin metal read Walker House Porch Fellowship and the letters were uneven in the way honest things are. We clapped and sipped sweet tea and as the sun settled the cameras blinked their kind little blinks and the deadbolt gave its soft promise and for the first time in a long time I felt a tenderness for the street itself. The same week I met with the pastor and Sister Bernice to set up a hotline linked to the church phone tree for elders who needed help with paperwork or with a listening ear. We kept the number simple and posted it on the bulletin board near the choir robes. On Tuesday at noon an old friend from the pantry called and said she had a cousin who might need advice. Send her, I said. We will give her coffee and a folder and a pencil, and we will teach her to write down what happened so that her own story can protect her. On Wednesday Angela and I stood in the lobby when the first mentorship tenant arrived with a suitcase and a brave chin. We took her upstairs and showed her the lamp with the soft shade and the bed with the new sheets and the basket of toiletries and the list on the fridge that said groceries pantry pickup on Friday and counseling at the church office on Monday. She exhaled the way you exhale when your back finds a chair and her eyes filled. And she said I thought I was finished and I said you are not finished, you are starting. That night I stood at the kitchen window and watched the streetlights thumb on. I put Robert's letter back in the envelope and set it in a drawer where any future storm can find it. There is a peace that arrives after justice. It is not loud. It is the peace of knowing you can sleep in your own bed and wake in your own name, and make coffee in your own kitchen and lock and unlock your own door according to your own wisdom. I turned to the camera for a soft word because many of you hold your own papers and your own quiet strength. If this gave you courage, say truth wins and tell me the city where you are listening. I want to see the map of your steady selves. Then come back for the next story. We will sit on this porch together and learn again that freedom is not a shout, it is a practice. And even a heart that has been bruised can beat in order again.